So thank you all so much for being here. As Samara said, if I haven't met you, my name is Dr. Jacob Goodin. And this is part 2 in a 2-part series of how to implement a resistance training program. So Dr. Brent Alvar is in attendance, and he had an excellent part 1 that I wasn't able to attend, but that gives us a really good segue into, there was all the health benefits, and now what can we do about it? How can we start a resistance training program today? And that's what I'll hope to cover. So in this presentation, I'll give you just a short anecdote about my journey and foray into resistance training. We'll clarify some terms. We'll talk about some principles of resistance training. We'll look at exercise classification and how the body moves in a variety of different ways. And then we'll kind of put that all together into a basic plan that you could start on, whether you have a gym membership, whether you have dumbbells at home or resistance bands, or just your own body weight. And then I would like to allow ample time for questions at the end. And if we don't answer everything today, that's okay. You guys have my Point Loma email. I'm sure you could find it. And I'd be happy to meet with you over coffee or lunch or in my office or at the weight shed or in the weight room. I love doing that kind of thing. All right? So let's begin. So the goal today, as I said, is to equip you to begin resistance training. Like, you should be able to go home after this presentation, and if I've done my job well, then you should be able to knock out a 15-minute body weight circuit or band-resisted circuit, or grab your dumbbells and start moving them in ways that would strengthen your body, right? And so that's the goal. Everything that we do today and we talk about is with this goal in mind. Okay, so first, I didn't always resistance train. It actually wasn't until I was 21 that I think I picked up my first barbell, believe it or not. I was a distance runner for my whole life. I ran the mile at Westmont College. Yeah, is there another distance runner in the room? Yeah? Yep. Good. Okay, I'm a recovering endurance athlete, so we could talk later about, that process of withdrawal, etc. So this is me, I think my junior year of college. Fast forward 10 or 11 years, and then I've been resistance training since then. I sustained some injuries as a runner, and so I converted, right, to the strength sport. Now, my dissertation, actually all of my graduate work took place at a university with an associated Olympic training site, and we trained Olympic weightlifters. So I figured as I got there, as a 150-pound ex-distance runner who could no longer run due to injuries, I figured I better start squatting so that my quads are at least half the size of some of these guys who I'm working with every day. And it took a while, and they're still about 3/4 of the size, but I'm at least getting there. So some takeaways from that journey before we begin, because I know all of you are at various points, whether you're going to start your resistance training journey today, or whether maybe you're somewhere in the middle there. Here are some takeaways from mine so far. The first is that there are many, many ways to resistance train. I didn't always use a barbell to train. Now I primarily use barbells and dumbbells, but you can use bands, you can use your body weight, you can use your own kids, as Brent Alvar was talking about in his presentation. There are many ways to train. There's no right way or wrong way necessarily. It's about how you implement these various tools. Another takeaway is that self-improvement is very addicting. That's one of the amazing things about resistance training, is that you can always find a way to improve. You can improve your upper body strength, your lower body strength. You can improve your 10 repetition maximum, your 1 repetition maximum. You can improve the speed with which you move through repetitions. You can improve the number of repetitions you can do in a minute or in 2 minutes or in 30 seconds. There's so many little goals along the way that you can set and achieve, and it's a very addicting and fun and fulfilling process. Another takeaway I've had is that consistent small gains compound over time. So don't try to shoot for the moon in week 2, right? Just shoot for a small improvement. We might leave today thinking, yes, I'm going to get stronger, I'm going to become more toned, less fat, bigger muscle, etc., but just look for those small gains because they really do add up. If we're thinking about our lifetime of fitness, right, and this body, this aggregate of molecules that God gave us to move around, and if we want to improve that over time, we have quite a few years to do it. So let's not think in terms of 4-week phases. Let's think in terms of years. Where do I want to be a year from now? And those small gains will compound. The next takeaway I've had, and for you to think about as we're going through this lecture, is to modify training, but don't miss it. If you've set a goal to work out 3 days a week, and maybe you've, hurt your knee because you tripped, well, don't just not work out. Maybe it becomes an upper body training week for you. Modify the training plan, but don't miss it entirely. It's those consistent gains. As long as you're doing something, then you're still improving over time. And then finally, the middle road is usually the best place to start. So in fitness and in resistance training, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's also a lot of good information, so don't get me wrong. Instagram, YouTube, Google are all very good places to get information, but you have to know how to filter it. Now, if you hear somebody talking about extremes, never do this, always do this, it's probably actually somewhere in the middle. And hopefully these principles and movement patterns that we go through today can give you a lens through which to filter some of that information. All right? So that's where we're coming from. We're going to dive into the terms right now. So some basic terms so we're all on the same page with how to speak about resistance training. So the first set of terms has to do with your body, and these are very basic. It should be a review for some of you, and for some of you it might be new. Muscle tissue, right? Muscle tissue is the only tissue in your body capable of producing force, right? It's a contractile tissue. We see an example here of the bicep muscle in your forearm. I want everyone to palpate their bicep. Feel it, touch it. Good. Now, palpate the bicep of the person next to you. You don't have to do that, no. But if you feel comfortable, right? Now, tendon is a type of tissue that transmits force from muscle into bone, right? You see these little white tendinous junctions on either side of the biceps muscle. There has to be something that transmits force into bone, and that's what tendon does. Tendon is really good at that. If we think of our Achilles tendon when we're running, if you picture a sprinter or maybe even a cheetah, they have very long, very thick Achilles tendons that transfer a lot of force very efficiently. The next type of tissue is fat, and we usually think of fat in a negative way as far as fitness goes, but fat is very important for insulation, hormonal regulation. It's our largest store and source of energy. Oftentimes, though, in a weight training program, we are seeking to minimize our own body fat that we've accumulated due to our sedentary lifestyles. And then finally, a joint. When I talk about a joint, that's the articulation of two different bones on each other. So in the picture, we have an elbow joint, right, which you could say is the articulation of 3 bones on each other to form your elbow joint. And so when we talk about resistance training, we're usually talking about strengthening a muscle that transmits force through a tendon in order to move a joint, right? And so when we move those joints, we can then backtrack and think about what muscles are we actually strengthening if we think about it in that way. Now, another set of terms. Force is the acceleration of a mass, right? When we exert force with our muscles, we're accelerating a mass, whether it's our own body, whether it's a medicine ball, whether it's a resistance band, or a barbell, we're accelerating that other mass, right? And as the great sports scientist and coach, Master Yoda says, use the force you must, right? I think that was in his second documentary as he was training young Luke Skywalker. So strength is the ability to produce force, and when we resistance train, this is what we are doing. We're demonstrating strength in order to stimulate our body to further adaptations to produce more strength, more ability to produce force. Resistance then is that force that opposes the force that we create with our muscles. So if I'm exerting force this way, whatever thing I'm exerting force on, whether it's the earth, right, in a push-up, or a barbell, or my children as they're over me and I'm bench pressing them as we're wrestling, they are the resistance, right? Now, as our muscles encounter resistance, there's 3, but really we're going to talk about 2 different types of muscle contraction. Concentric muscle contraction is when your muscle shortens under tension, and eccentric is the opposite. It's when the muscle lengthens under tension. So now let's go back to the elbow joint and consider our bicep muscle that we talked about. Now I want you all to allow your hand to hang down by your side. So now my elbow joint is extended, and I want you to contract your bicep muscle. You can even touch it as it contracts and you'll feel it harden. And as I contract it, it's contracting concentrically, meaning it's shortening to close this angle of my elbow joint. And as I relax it down slowly, if you control that movement, now you're slowly resisting against gravity and your muscle is lengthening eccentrically. Most of our resistance training movements, they involve both muscle actions. So if we think of a bicep curl, it starts with a concentric movement and ends with an eccentric movement. If we think about a barbell squat or even a bodyweight squat, it starts with an eccentric movement of your quads and hamstrings and glutes and calf muscles. And then it ends with a concentric movement because now those muscles shorten to overcome the weight and stand back up. Are there any questions on those so far? Very good. Then you all get an A on the test at the end. Now, we also have to talk about programming terminology. These are terms that we use to prescribe resistance training programs. So a repetition is one complete motion of an exercise. So going back to the bicep curl, I'm starting at the bottom, I come up, that's a concentric contraction, I go down, that's eccentric, and that would be one repetition of a bicep curl, right? If I did it again, that's 2 repetitions, and so forth. A set is a series of unbroken repetitions. So if my plan calls for a set of 10, it might say, 1 by 10, 1x 10 bicep curls. That means one set of 10 repetitions of bicep curls. So I would sit there and crank out 10 of them with an appropriate weight, right? And when I rest in between sets, 1 minute, 2 minutes, whatever your plan calls for, and I start it again, that's the start of a second set of 10. So if we have our friend Ron here, he's a local newscaster. I don't know if you noticed, but he's doing a set of 1,000 bicep curls. So he's performed 1,000 bicep curls in a row, supposedly, without resting. And that would be 1 times 1,000 bicep curls. One set of 1,000 bicep curls. Now the volume in a resistance training program is the amount of work that's being accomplished. And we would usually just multiply the sets times the repetitions times the weight, right? So if say he's curling 20 pounds and he's doing one set of 1,000 repetitions, what's the volume of work that our friend Ron is accomplishing? What was that? 20, I hear 20,000, someone say? Yeah, very good math. He's done 20,000 pounds of work, right? That's the volume of work that he's done. Now the intensity of a program depends on the percent of maximum effort or exertion. So here the intensity is measured in load. The intensity would be 20 pounds. You could also measure it as a percentage of your 1 repetition maximum. So let's say that the most that Ron can curl is say 40 pounds. Then he's working at 50% intensity. There's also a lot of other ways to measure intensity because say if you're using a resistance band, you can't really take percentages of a resistance band. So you might look at percent effort on a scale of 1 to 10. Maybe that was a 7 out of 10, right? It was fairly challenging. Or maybe, you worked out with your friend and you guys were really psyched up. You had some coffee beforehand and you had a really killer workout. And at the end, maybe you rated it 9 out of 10, because it was very challenging. That would be just a different way to measure intensity in a resistance training program. But the point is that we should probably pay attention to both volume and intensity as we go week to week in our training programs, and we'll see how those things can build upon each other. Okay, a couple more pages of terms, but now we're getting into some implements, things that you can lift, because I told you there are many different ways to resistance train, and there are many different tools that you can use. And a lot of times for people starting out, the confusion lies in, well, is a barbell better, or is a dumbbell better, or is a medicine ball or a resistance band better, or is body weight only better? I hear these questions all the time, so I'll just describe them all to you, and then we'll look at how we can incorporate all of them. So first, a barbell is just a long, loadable metal bar. They come in two sizes, a standard size and an Olympic size. The standard size has a smaller diameter on the sleeve, and so the plates have a smaller hole in them. I believe it's an inch. Is that right, Dr. Alvar? It's an inch in diameter. The Olympic barbell, which is more, you'll see that more frequently in a gym, they have a larger diameter sleeve, and so the plates have a larger hole. They're loadable up to heavier ranges. And a dumbbell, not a barbell, but a dumbbell, these are shorter metal bars that are sometimes loadable, sometimes they're fixed. So you see dumbbells come in pairs. You can have a set of 10s, a set of 20s, a set of 30s. But you can also have dumbbell handles that you can load with plates. So you could load them up to 50 pounds or strip them down to 10 pounds. And those are often better, for a garage gym setup. A plate is any hunk of metal or plastic or rubber that you would then slap onto those barbells or dumbbells, right? They could be metal, they could be urethane so that they bounce and they don't damage your floor. And then recently we've also had the addition in most gyms of kettlebells. These came out of Russia, and they used to literally be like tea kettles that you fill with cement. But now they look a little bit more like cannonballs with handles, right? And you see people swinging these around and doing tricks with them, but you can do a lot of really great resistance training with these as well. All right, these are kind of 4 of your standardized implements. You can track the load. You can increase load in small increments. And you'll find these at most of your commercial gyms. Some of you might have these at home. Raise your hand if you guys have a dumbbell or a barbell or a kettlebell at your house. Excellent, excellent. Now, more things you can lift. We know that there are machine exercises, right? Whether they are selectorized or plate loaded, or cable or camshaft, right? They allow for single or multi-joint movements through usually a fixed pattern. So you see these at the YMCA or at Planet Fitness, right? These larger, more kind of global fitness conglomerates, right? They have these there, and these are great if you want to go machine to machine and resistance train that way. The only problem is we can't get these into our garage usually because they cost a few $1,000s each, but they're a great way to train if you have access to them. We also have medicine balls, which there's a couple of those around the room. It's just a weighted ball. Some of them bounce, some don't. Resistance bands, and these are becoming ever more increasingly popular. You can buy some of these on Amazon for very cheap, have them at your door in 2 days or 1 day, and start training tomorrow with them. And then we can even use sandbags to train, right? You don't need to buy a fancy sandbag. Those are usually expensive. Just get an old duffel bag, get 2 garbage bags, so you have a double lining. Go to the beach if that's legal. It might not be. When I started off as a personal trainer in Santa Barbara, I went to the beach at night a couple of times to fill my sandbags. But go to Home Depot, buy a bag of sand, and you can fill that duffel bag, and you can do all kinds of sort of unstable implement training with a sandbag. Very cheap. Now, stay tuned, because there's even more things that you can lift. You could lift a log, right? When I visit my parents, my dad has a small, not really a farm, but kind of a farm. I lift logs at my dad's house because they refuse to buy a barbell. You can lift big rocks, which has been a tradition for thousands of years in Iceland and Scotland. There's plenty of rocks lying around, and they're free. Something that's not quite as free, but there's a few of these around your house, perhaps. You can lift your kids. We do this a lot. You can even, maybe your kids are out of the house and you're empty nesters, or maybe you're looking forward to having kids, or maybe you just are married and not expecting kids. You can lift your spouse. And you can do that anywhere, right? So you go on a hike with your spouse and you say, hey, hop on my back for a little bit. I'll give you a ride. Just make sure you return the favor. Okay, so that was the terminology, right? We covered the very basics of musculature and joints. We looked at resistance training terminology. We talked about sets and reps, and we talked about a bunch of different implements. I'm going to pause there, see if you guys have any specific questions about that before we go on. Yes?
Are you going to make some recommendations about different kinds of, so like kettlebells versus dumbbells versus whatever?
Yeah, so here's what I'll say about that, because we're about to go into movement patterns, and we're going to see that you can use any of these implements to add resistance to any movement pattern. So it's kind of one of those very sort of unhelpful answers that is yes to all of those. They're all good as long as you implement them correctly. Now, if we wanted to optimize training, that's a very different question than training for health, right? So in my research and my practice, I'm optimizing training for athletes to achieve the highest performance possible. So we are typically sticking with the implement that best accomplishes that in the movement pattern and sort of, force characteristics of their sport that they need to train in, right? So we're doing Olympic lifts with the barbells, we're doing heavy back squats and deadlifts, we're doing, power drills maybe with the medicine balls, explosive things with bands, but we're being very specific. When you're training for health and you're training for, just general health benefits, it really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? So you can continue to increase and improve and get stronger to a point with any of the implements. That said, I think barbells are the best, hands down, because of the force that you can produce, because of the symmetry that they produce, because they're closed chain, or they tend to be. You can move them slower, you can move them fast. They're infinitely scalable. And when you couple those with the benefits of dumbbells as well, you don't really need that much else, right? But how many of you guys have access to a barbell with a full set of plates? Yeah, much fewer than raised the hands earlier. Any other questions? All right, then we'll move on. Okay, so a few principles around which we will design our resistance training programs. The first is the SRA Principle, or the principle that says specific adaptations will occur based on the demands that you impose on your body, right? Your body will adapt to the specific stresses that are placed on it. So let me ask you this question. Of these two athletes who are both sponsored by Nike and wearing the same jersey, which of these, if you can see, I don't know how well you guys can see, which of these athletes is a distance runner? The one on the left or the one on the right? The left. And which one is a sprinter? Right. The right. Right. Because their training is very specific and their body has adapted specifically to those demands. The one on the left, if he lifts weights, does it with a different intention than the athlete on the right. The athlete on the left trains, obviously, for endurance. The one on the right trains for very short, explosive events. And so their bodies have adapted differently. Yes, they probably started out different genetically as well, and then they've taken that to the extremes with training. Right? So when we think about things like repetition ranges in weight training, we want to think about the SRA Principle. So if you are training for strength, the best rep range to train for strength is between 1 and about 6 or 7, right? This chart comes from the NSCA, which is the national accrediting body for strength and conditioning coaches. So if you're using a load that you can only lift about 5 or 6 times or less, then you're training purely for strength. Does that mean if you're training, for sets of 15 that you get no strength adaptation? No, you do get some. But going back to the question of what's optimal, if you're really training for strength, then it's about 6. Anything more, you're training something different. Now, if you want to train for increased muscle size, the fancy word for that is hypertrophy or hypertrophy, right? Among my colleagues, we'll say, like, how many hypertrophies have you won this year, right? If you're training for muscular size, then if you're going heavier than sets of 6, then you're probably not inducing much hypertrophy. Again, if you're training sets of 20 or above, you're probably not inducing very much hypertrophy. You want to stick in this sweet spot about 7 or 8 up to maybe 13 or 14 repetitions, right? And this doesn't mean that you're moving a light weight and you're just stopping there. this means you're using a weight that you can only lift for that many repetitions, right? Now, we see power with an asterisk. Is that how you say that word? Asterisk? I don't know, I can't pronounce it. It's there because when you train for power, you need to move things quickly. Power is the product of both force and velocity. So you're doing these power training movements with considerable load, but moving quickly. So if I trained my back squat for sets of 5, I would use a heavier load than training my back squat for power for sets of 5. I would, reduce the weight and be able to move that bar very quickly, but stop at 5 reps. Because after that, the movement will slow down and I will no longer be training for power. Right? We train specifically for what our goal is. Now, for most of you, if you're just starting a resistance training program, this matters a lot less than maybe for some of the Point Loma athletes that we might see in the weight room. And that's because the wonderful thing about resistance training that Dr. Alvar mentioned several times is when you're starting out, almost anything will induce most of these changes. If you train for strength, you'll get more powerful, your muscles will be more enduring. If you train for hypertrophy or muscular endurance, you'll also see some strength and power benefits, right? You get all of it right off the bat, and your gains will be much more rapid in the first 1 to 2 years of training than they will ever be after that. The gains do slow down, they still come, right? Even up into your 80s and 90s, research has shown, but in the first couple years, you'll get most of these gains. Now the next principle, right, we have to train with specificity, but we also have to overload our training. So training must be more intense or voluminous or novel in order to disrupt our homeostasis, right? Remember, homeostasis is like the set point of our body. It's where we're comfortable when we're sitting in our chairs and not doing anything. And we need to disrupt homeostasis by increasing one of these things. So if you went home tonight and you did some body weight circuit and you hadn't before, you would be disrupting your homeostasis. But at some point, that same body weight circuit, if you keep doing it, it will no longer encourage adaptation from your body. You will plateau. And so we have to increase some aspect, we have to overload some aspect of our training, whether that's intensity or volume or novelty. So here's just a little graph that shows, if we're looking at units of volume, you would increase units of volume each week and then maybe take a down week every 5th week or every 4th week to allow your body to more fully recover, and then you start to ramp it up again, right? This allows us to avoid overtraining and keeps us from plateauing in our training. Okay, a couple more principles to get through. The next one is the principle of stimulus, recovery, and adaptation. So if you went and did a bench pressing workout in a gym, maybe you did some bench press and you did some close grip bench press and then finished with push-ups, that type of training will increase your bench press, but it won't increase your bench press strength immediately afterwards, right? You'll be tired, and if you tested your bench press 1 repetition maximum after that workout, it would have gone down. And that's because of this principle. After we train, our body, our baseline strength actually decreases as we're recovering, right? And that return to baseline represents the recovery process. When you lift weights, your body damages itself. But it's through that recovery process and subsequent adaptation that now we've raised our baseline strength, right? So we need to keep this in mind because it would inform how frequently we train. Maybe we shouldn't train legs really heavy, right? Twice in a row, do it Monday and then do it again Tuesday. Because maybe on Tuesday we're going to be deep in the throes of recovery and adaptation. And the last thing you want to do is train legs again. You probably don't even want to walk up the stairs again, right, after leg day. And so we have to keep this in mind. The next principle is the principle of variation. Now, I think in the fitness community at large, right now variation is kind of touted as one of those #1 principles, and I'm sure you guys are all thinking this term right now in your head. It's muscle confusion, right, from P90X. Anyone heard of that term? A few people, I see some nods. Yeah, so they do kind of have a point. You do sort of confuse your muscles with novel exercises, but it's really maybe the 3rd or 4th most important principle. Specificity and overload and SRA are definitely more important, but we do need to change the training stimulus over time. So if you are doing push-ups for your chest and triceps and shoulders, and that's the only thing that you do forever, you'll get really good at push-ups, but at some point you'll stop increasing in strength and strength endurance and muscularity. You need to change it up. You need to change it up not only for increased performance, but to minimize your risk of injury. Because if we're stressing the joints in the same way, day in and day out, in the same movement pattern grooves, then your body doesn't handle that very well. And if we just changed it slightly, maybe just go to wide arm push-ups, or maybe go to close grip push-ups, or maybe go to elevated push-ups, that changes it enough to present a novel stimulus and to hopefully prevent injury. There's a bunch of things we can vary. We can vary the load, we can vary the tempo, the frequency, the number of repetitions, the technique with which you do the exercise, the implement that you use, or the entire exercise itself, right? So as an example, here are 4 different variations of a squatting pattern. On the left, we have what's called a goblet squat. The athlete or squatter is holding a small kettlebell in front of his body. Notice his upright torso, his knees are maybe slightly behind his toes, right? Here, he's in a front squat position with a barbell, and then in a high bar back squat position, and then in a low bar back squat position. Slight changes to his technique in all of these at the bottom of his squat, a different implement in some of them, but they're all squatting patterns, right? So this is just demonstrating that small tweaks in exercise selection are really all that you need. You don't need to wildly change things up from day to day, week to week, or even month to month. Now the last principle that we're going to look at is the principle of involution. And all that this principle tells us is that all fitness characteristics, strength, power, speed, aerobic ability, they all decay with time. Right? And I think we know this intuitively, but sometimes I think we assume, oh, I trained for a period of time and I will always have what I trained for. Unfortunately, that's not the case. You go back to baseline, right? So if we see in the graph on the right side of the screen, once we achieve that adaptation here, and we've achieved that peak adaptation and peak fitness, if you don't present your body with another stimulus, eventually you'll go back to normal, right? And I think, maybe after Christmas break or an extended holiday or time off, right? You come back from the beach from Hawaii for a couple of weeks, if you've been, just lounging. I think we've experienced the decreases in fitness that follow, right? The cool thing is maximum strength hangs on for a lot longer than most other fitness qualities. You lose speed first, then followed by power. Maximum strength and aerobic ability are 2 that hang on for quite a while. So that is an upside. All right, we have enough time. We're going to get into some active moving stuff in a minute when we look at movement patterns. But before we go on, are there any questions about some of these principles I've talked about? Yes?
When you say that you've reached that peak and then your numbers start going down, what do you mean? Like your muscle starts to get smaller and your like hypertension, pre-diabetes, the metabolic stuff?
Good question. Good question. So as far as the health benefits go, I don't know how transient those gains are. I do know that if you have made those gains through activity and then you cease activity, most likely they'll fall off. I don't know the half-life of that though. What I am sure of is any performance increase, whether it's muscle size, muscle strength, muscle power, changes in the musculotendinous unit, those types of things, those will eventually fall off. Maybe Dr. Alvar could speak to the health benefits falling off.
Our health-related benefits are only going to maintain as long as we continue to have that adaptation through exercise. So it's not an ongoing protected. Think of it this way: if we're active as children, we have a protected benefit from being active. If we cease activity as a child, we no longer have that health-related benefit that is associated with that activity. So just like the gains in fitness, the protected element of exercise and resistance training has a shelf life, or has a term of protectiveness associated with it.
And the best example I can think of, and I apologize if this characterizes anyone in the room, is if you look at the high school football players when you were in high school, right, who maybe were the peak of high school fitness and you thought, oh man, like they're so strong and fast. That's what I thought as a skinny distance runner. Now when I look at them, 20 years later or 10 years later, they are no longer training and they no longer look how they did and they can no longer run quite as fast as they did. And they are maybe several sizes larger than they were. And so all of that training in high school has ceased to pay off for them, essentially. Yeah, what other questions? Yes, Jess?
How long would you say that takes? So like if you stopped exercising for a couple months,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a couple months is pushing the envelope for maintaining your maximum strength output. So maximum strength sticks around for about 20 to 30 days before it starts decreasing. Now your skill level at expressing that strength will diminish more quickly. So let's say that you hit an all-time high back squat, right? A 1 repetition maximum, and then you just took a month off because you earned it, right? And you went on vacation, and if you came back, you most likely would have most of that strength, but your skill at expressing the strength would have decreased. So you'd do a session or two where you practice back squatting and then you'd have it again. But your other fitness characteristics, it's between 1 and 3 weeks that they start to fall off. So when we talk about frequency of resistance training, really we want to get another session within 7 days because a lot of those start to fall off within 3 or 4 days, especially the motor programming and skill acquisition of the movements. Yes?
When you say that, like let's say we all go and we do stairs today after work,
Mm-hmm.
something new or different. How long should we delay before we do that activity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that depends on the volume and the intensity of the activity for you, right? So some of us might be able to do 20 sets of stairs, and it would be maybe a moderate intensity, moderate volume activity compared to what they were previously doing. Maybe some of us haven't even walked up a set of stairs in a while, and so doing that same set of 20 would be a huge increase. It might be a 10 out of 10 on the intensity scale for them, and so they would definitely need to take some time off. Some things you can use to gauge the time that you take between training sessions. First is soreness, and second is general feelings of fatigue and motivation. Now, I hesitate with the motivation part because I know that's like, well, I don't feel like it, so Dr. Goodin said I don't have to do it. But if you still feel sore, soreness should last. The longest we see delayed onset muscle soreness lasting is about 6 to 7 days in the literature. Anything more than that, and you were probably in a car wreck, you probably didn't train, right? That's something different, and maybe you should back off. So 3 days about it would be maybe the maximum that I would say that soreness should stick around for, maybe 4 days. If you had some sort of crazy laboratory-induced soreness, or you are a professional bodybuilder, then maybe 5, 6, or 7 days. So to answer your question, to be safe, 48 to 72 hours. But if you have a trainer who knows what they're doing, you could train the same muscle group 2 days in a row. That's fine if it's relatively low volume or relatively low intensity. Good questions. All right, let's get to the movement part. So we're going to talk about exercise classification. There's a lot of different ways to classify an exercise, but I like classifying them into movement patterns, right? You could classify them by muscles worked, you could classify them by implements that you use, but if we talk about movement patterns, then there are inherently certain muscle groups that are attached more or less to each movement pattern, and you can think about this pattern with any implement that's available to you, whether it's a barbell, a resistance band, a rock, your spouse, or just your body, right? So we're going to go through these. I'm going to show you some examples, and then what I want you to do in your group for 45 seconds is to pick up the implements on your table and figure out a way to train that movement pattern with what you have at the table, all right? So I'll show you this, and then I'll ask you guys to stand up, and I'll call on 1 or 2 people to show us what you came up with. Okay, so the first movement pattern, oh yeah, get ready to move, is a push, right? So a push, or an upper body push, involves your arms, and you're pushing something away from you, whether it's horizontally or vertically, right? We could have a horizontal push, or we can have a vertical push. The muscle groups involved here are going to be the triceps, the shoulders, and the chest muscles, right? Now, some examples, a push-up, right? You're pushing your body away from the earth, or if you're large enough and muscular enough, when you do a push-up, the earth actually moves away from you when you do a push-up. You just have to acquire enough gravity to do that. If you flip over and you're on a bench, you could do a bench press, pushing a barbell away from your body. You could also obviously do that with dumbbells. Or you could maybe press some dumbbells or a barbell overhead. These are all pushing movements, and they all work the same muscles in a slightly different way. Okay, so all right, so we're going to wrap up with a starting point for how you can develop your own resistance training program based on what you have at home. Oops, so these are the steps. I'm sure you read them as I was talking. 5 steps. It's fairly simple as long as we keep in mind the principles and the movement patterns that I've talked about. So first, we have to pick a goal. There's 3 primary goal types when we're considering starting a program. The first is for health benefits, like Dr. Alvar talked about so well in his presentation. The next, and I think sometimes undervalued goal, is for aesthetics. I mean, because how many of us don't want to look at least a little bit better, right? And I think it's totally fine to say, hey, I'm only training to look a little bit better than I do right now. And you'll get these other benefits on top of it as a bonus. And then the third would be for performance, right? So maybe you don't care about how you look. Maybe you don't care about your health, but I hope we all do. Maybe you just want to be as strong as you can get, or as fast as you can get. Or maybe you're training so that you can play ultimate frisbee better, or play in a rec soccer league without blowing out your knee, right? So those would be performance benefits. Given those 3 goal types that you would hone in on, the most common resistance training specific goals that you can accomplish with lifting weights, lifting bands, etc., are increases in muscle size, increases in muscular strength, increases in muscular power, or decreases in body fat, right? Along with all the other health goals that Dr. Alvar talked about, these are the primary goals when we're considering our muscle tissue. A lot of times when I talk to people, they'll say, oh, I don't really want to get bigger muscles. I just want to get toned, or I just want to look toned, right? And what that means, what I translate that as, is I actually do want bigger muscles, and I just want less body fat. Because when you say somebody looks toned, what that really is a decrease in body fat, so you can see their muscles a little better, and maybe a slight increase or a slight hypertrophy of the muscles that they have. And so that doesn't make somebody look bulky, it just makes them look a little bit more fit. And with the increased resting tension from your neuromuscular system, from resistance training, you will achieve that toned look that you're looking for, right? So I say that so that we're not afraid to train for increased muscle size in those sets of 8 to 12, because that's actually one of the best repetition ranges as you're just starting out. Okay, the means. What equipment do you have, right? Is it just body weight? Maybe you have dumbbell pairs. Maybe you have a whole gym set up because you're a member of, I don't know, the YMCA or some other gym in town. We have to assess the time. Do you have 60 minutes to work out, or do you just have 15? We can accomplish a lot in 15 minutes with our training program. Do you have 1 day a week to work out, or 7, or somewhere in between? What's your skill level? Do you have a trainer who can supplement your skill level, right? Maybe you're a novice, but maybe you have a good trainer that you've hired, and so you do have access to the full gym setup, and you can have a slightly more complex program. What's your motivation, right? Be honest with yourself. Is it low or is it very high? Again, do you have a trainer to motivate you, a training partner? All of these things should go into planning your program, because the best program is the one that you're going to do, right? If I sat down with you and we came up with an amazing program and you didn't do it, it wouldn't be worth anything. We need to consider rep ranges, and I'm going to go a little faster because I know I'm running out of time. We need to consider progression. So these are 3 examples of how we can progress. The top, we're adding a set of exercises every week, or maybe we can keep the sets the same and add repetitions every week, or maybe we can increase the load or intensity every week, or some combination of those 3, right? But we have some sort of measurable overload. We're including all of the body movement categories: pushes, pulls, squats, lunges for day 1, Day 2 could be a push and a pull again, and then a hinge, and one that we didn't look at so much was a loaded carry. That's where you're walking and holding heavy implements like you would when you're bringing the groceries in. Right, so that's an example of accomplishing it with 2 days a week with just your body weight. This is the same setup with dumbbells. So now we have the same movement patterns, but we're changing the exercise selection because now we have dumbbells that we can use. A fourth example is if you have 4 days and you have a full gym setup. So now we have barbell exercises, we have some dumbbell exercises, we're hitting the 6 major movement patterns, right? And we have 2 upper body days and 2 lower body days. So we can start to differentiate because we have more days available to work with. So I haven't given you a program. I've given you hopefully some principles, some tools, and some movement patterns to begin to think about a program that you can accomplish on your own, given your implements, right? Whether it's just body weight or all the way up to a full gym setup, given your time, given the days of the week that you have to commit to this. And my hope is that you guys can go home and just start and remember that small gains over time add up. Remember that consistency is going to be key. As long as we continue overloading, right, here and there, getting a repetition PR or a weight PR, that means personal record, increasing the load, that you will get stronger and you will reap the benefits of resistance training. So we'll end there for questions.